So music and architecture, it really is a pleasure to have the opportunity to kind of sort of open out some thoughts that I've had over the past few years. Bit of background, I'm an architect. I run a practice in London called Surface. And before studying architecture, I was at some level a musician, particularly involved in jazz, and just generally interested. And I think what I found, that this talk has given me the opportunity to kind of reflect on that and to kind of work out that I think what I've done over the years since kind of moving away from kind of active music per se, what I've done is kind of sublimated that interest, channeled that interest into architecture. And that really does mean something in terms of the way I work, because not only does that sort of infuse a certain kind of language, musical language literally, into our everyday working throughout the working day, it also affects how we think of the process of architecture, so kind of the making, so not just the product and process distinction is an important one that you'll pick up from the talk. Another thing is that I was keen to inadvertently challenge what Cany said earlier on when she was referring to Hegel's kind of structure of music being basically at the top of the pile. And it just struck me that having called my talk, I don't know if you realise that, I called it music is not, or sort of architecture is not frozen music. It occurs to me that what I'm doing here today is talking as an architect to a group of musicians, and that's a kind of inversion of the normal causal relationship that I normally experience with music and architecture, which is whereby music is able to influence the architecture. So there's a kind of mirroring of the normal relationship that we normally have. And therefore it just kind of made me think about things like a more classical mode of thinking about the relationship, whereby indeed music is the kind of master discourse, down from which other things are kind of influenced. And it reminded me of things like frozen music is really a very classical way of thinking about things. And of course we're in a very non-classical era, so I just thought it would be important to kind of say, well, let's just kind of flip that and think about why that's problematic now. So frozen music suggests actually a very static view of what architecture is, and I'd rather like to think about architecture as something that continually has a sense of mystery and unfolding quality to it. And in fact, somewhat like music, there is something of a performative aspect of it. So with a composer's product, that product is subject to the performance values of each subsequent performance. And architecture is very much the same. What we try to do in my practice is to kind of prefigure that and to remember that, rather than just sort of creating something which is kind of conceptually fixed.
Now, I've got to the kind of stage that I'm at the moment with which is very much work in progress in terms of my office. But where I've got to has been basically an outcome of a series of breakthroughs, and I'm sure that everyone in this room has exactly the same experience, that you kind of have your sort of what you do and how you do it has become such a thing because of some really significant moments in our careers and in our lives, whether at the age of 12 or whether when we were doing our A-levels or at university or even when we're doing commissions. And what I've found is that all of the really big breakthroughs that I've made, I mean, maybe there are, in terms of my own self, there's probably about 7 in terms of my architecture. And they've all been when music has been to the fore. So not just music as a sound, but music as a kind of a practice or a concept. And probably most significantly was with John Cage. Incidentally, I did my postgraduate thesis when I was studying architecture on the work of John Cage, who significantly isn't an architect, but obviously a musician, but a musician who took a very, very broad view of what music was. And I think that was the key to kind of everything he was doing and promoting. that he had a rather liberal view of music itself. And actually, I think it's worth stating that I take an incredibly broad view of what architecture is. And having taken such a view, it then becomes very, very natural to be able to talk about music in architecture, or even music is architecture. Otherwise, I'd have to rely on irony to make the connection. But I'm not being ironic with anything I say. And then as a composer, or rather from me personally, another bit about my background is that I was a musician. I was also dyslexic, and that's been a huge sort of, due to the kind of compensatory behaviour that you develop, that's been really kind of advantageous as an architect. A lot of architects are dyslexic. And one of the things I struggled with as a musician was reading music. I just found it just too much to, if I was playing the piano, just to follow the music at the same time was just sort of too much for me. And so when I found John Cage's work, of course, all of these highly graphic and inventive and explosive and, if you like, deconstructive works or methods were absolutely fascinating to me. And of course, again, taking a very broad view, it's always about everything else as well. And so it's always then also about architecture. So let's just kind of think about that, again, taking a very broad view of music and of architecture. What would it be just to kind of have exactly the same sort of conversation about architecture as well? So again, whilst I've been just thinking about this, this particular project by a practice called OMA, Office of Metropolitan Architecture, is very much an outcome of a world in which the classical way of thinking just doesn't really exist anymore. And I would contest that this building in Seattle has a very powerful musical structure in that it's all about stringing together a series of objects, uses and experiences over a linear structure, which is then made more complex by folding it back on itself. And as such, what you create is something that, again, reminds me of a conception of the genius Mozart, who one suspects didn't work through his composing in the kind of normal way, but somehow had it kind of fully formed in his head, complete at once. And then he just had to write it down. I think that's interesting because it just suggests this kind of multi-dimensional, complex model, which I can only kind of connect with how computers now are, and the kind of parametric completeness which is now possible through the digital medium. And then what we see as a result is a context of extreme and expressed verticality, as it were, a kind of graph of economic success, against which this very, very powerful building is surprisingly diminutive, but it's by far the most powerful building in the area. And I would contend that its experiences over time, somewhat analogous to music, is infinite. And as we explore the building, very much the kind of field condition or the space, the background space of this image suggests basically a very rich bag of tricks. So it's all about the infinite, all about a series of strange, perverse, absurd possibilities, the glass floor to the right, for example.